Hello. If this video seems rushed, that's because it absolutely is. So right now I'm gonna go over 8.2. Uh, Hopefully you can see this. Uh, 8.2. Alright. And this is the revolutions in the Atlantic revolutions. And so we're if we're starting with the Atlantic revolutions, of course, we've got to start with the American Revolution, right? How can we start the without the American Revolution? So, um, let's just if we're gonna start with the American Revolution, let's just talk a little bit about the context, right? So, of course, you should know this by now, but the American colonists declared themselves independent. They declared their independence. The timeline for this is just you need to remember 1776. Uh, the 1776 colonists signed the Declaration of Independence, and that's really what we consider our Independence Day, July 4th, 1776, signing of the Declaration of Independence. And then in the 1780s, we finally win the war, right? So That's like just the timeline of the American Revolution. Now the thing is, we need to like the revolution essentially it got the American colonists independence from Britain, and the Declaration of Independence. What all it did really was it said, okay, we're independent from Britain, right? It declared their independence, and that's really important. You probably already know this document, but just keep it in mind. Um, just remember 1776 once again, and so now let's just talk about the first guiding question, right? And so that's like, in what ways did it transform democracy and how did it not, right? So we think of the American Revolution as causing lots of change, but in some ways it was actually quite conservative, as the textbook puts it. So let's talk about some changes and let's talk about some consistencies here. Okay? So things that changed, like it's things that changed, it's largely people's outlook, okay? Because people believed that they were creating a new society, right? A new society. And the other thing that changed was that it proved that Enlightenment ideals could be actually implemented in reality. So it proved um, Enlightenment ideals. And so like we can see that through let's see, we have the separation of church and state, for example. We've got the checks and balances. All of these are Enlightenment ideas proposed by these philosophers and thinkers during the Enlightenment. So these are changes, right? But at the same time, there were a lot of consistencies with the past, and the reason for that is because American society was already rather free and open compared to Britain, and this is in the sense that there were less class restrictions. Not that there was no class. By no means was there no class, but in the sense that there's no titled nobility, right? So there's no legal differences. And we're gonna get to France in a bit, but in France they have the three estates: the nobility, the clergy, and the commoners. There's no such thing like that. It's and also land is not as huge of an issue simply because there was a lot more land available to the colonists there, and so there's not as much of a distinction. Certainly, however, there were class differences. Like certain families would it might be considered to be more like quote unquote gentlemen, but and these people would be dressing in more European styles and all. However, that doesn't mean that doesn't undermine this idea. The legally so people interacted between classes more, and so that's a big difference. At the same time, these ideas of self governance were already there for a while because um, Britain mostly left the colonies alone for a long time, and so the colonies essentially developed their this idea that they had the right to govern themselves, and from the idea they created their own governments, and these governments for a long time had been fairly democratic in nature, or republican in nature, perhaps I should say. um and they would know the concepts of things like elected legislatures and things. They had been here for already quite a while. However, this revolution essentially sought to preserve those freedoms and the fact that they had their own government, because what happens is that after things like this, the 7 Years War, the what is it, the French and Indian War, I believe, these wars were of a global scale and they cost a lot, and this is problematic for the mother countries. So then they have to increase taxes, but the colonists had been already so independent, and they're getting taxed without having any representation in parliament. This is normal for a colonial power, but the colonists were not used to this, and they believed it was their right to govern themselves. And then we get the revolution. So that's basically what's the main thing with the American Revolution. In some ways, it was changing society, uh, because it essentially allowed us to basically prove these Enlightenment ideals, and at the same time, it allowed, like, having these things like codified kind of allowed us to pave the way for future democracy in America. It allowed us to give rise to movements such as the abolitionist movement, the feminist movement. These movements came because they had a place to. These ideas were becoming more and more prevalent, and these ideas, as we go over in 8.3, these ideas lead to those ideas of feminism and racial equality, at least those ideas increasing in popularity. Now, that's essentially it for the American Revolution. Once more, let's just go into the French Revolution, okay? So the French Revolution, as we all know, the French helped out the Americas a lot. After the Battle of Saratoga, the French saw that the Americans actually might have a chance of doing pretty good in the war, so then they decided to help out the Americans. And while those French soldiers are out there in the Americas, they pick up on some of those ideas that they saw there. And uh, so pretty much here's our timeline, okay? 1789, you gotta remember this year. 1789, we've got the King of France. He, you might want to remember his name. I can't recall his name right now. Queen was Marie Antoinette, but yeah, I can't remember the king's name right now. Anyways, so 1789, he calls the Estates General, which is essentially an assembly of three estates, because he was trying to increase taxes. Because once again, as I mentioned earlier, right, the French and Indian War, the 7 Years War, these are expensive because they're on a global scale. So he's trying to increase taxes, and unfortunately, the nobility doesn't want to increase taxes. So if he calls together the Estates General, then he can kind of also make that decision. So the Estates General has three estates, right? The first estate is the nobility. The second estate is the clergy, or is it clergy? I'm not sure how it's pronounced. And then the third estate is the commoners. So the first and second estate, the nobles and the nobles and the clergy make up only about 2% of the population. Unfortunately, the commoners only get one vote despite being 98% of the population. Doesn't make much sense, right? So the third estate gets pretty mad at this. So when they show up, kind of inspired by these ideals in America and the Enlightenment, they 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 leave the vote. They just abstain. They leave the vote, and they form what will be known as the National Assembly. And the National Assembly, essentially, the National Assembly is going to start by making France into a constitutional monarchy, and but before we get into that, one important thing is the before they do that, they sign what's called the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen. Okay, so the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen. So this is what's happened in 1789, and this is why it's considered the start of the French Revolution. The signing of um, this declaration essentially has all these ideas, and it's like, okay, we've got to make things more equal for all. That's kind of the main idea. So this kickstarts the French Revolution, and yeah, so these that's basically what's that. Oh, yeah, by the way, this was the first guiding question answered. What events launched the French Revolution? It's the third estate forming, leaving the vote and creating the what is it called? The National Assembly. Now, uh, what happens is that the next part of the timeline is that we're going to end up with this revolution becoming increasingly radical. As I mentioned earlier, they start off by trying to have a trying to have a constitutional monarchy, but a big problem is that the French Revolution doesn't come from some sort of like external colonial power trying to squeeze out money from the colonies as it did in the American Revolution. Instead, it comes out of deep schisms within French society and social conflicts. Uh, Among the nobles are unhappy about how the monarchs are taxing them more, and they don't like that. So that's why the aristocrats are a little unhappy. And then on the next level, in the commoners, we've got these wealthy urban merchants, and they they're increasing in power, but they resent the fact that becoming rich and stuff, but they still are superseded legally by the what is it, the nobles, right? So they don't like that. And the next thing is that next in the urban areas you have like the more normal urban people, right? But these people too are still resenting the power of the nobility, and they also they resent things like the growing prices of bread and economic problems, right? So, and then also even the next another social class is they've got the peasants in the countryside. There's not really serfdom; they're not serfs, but and there's not really as much feudalism. But at the same time, they don't really like the way that their noble lords are treating them. They don't like the fact that they have to be subservient to them. And so these deep social conflicts are running through French society, and this leads to the revolution essentially becoming a lot more radical than um, than the American Revolution. Sorry, I was plugging my device into power. Anyways, another thing like with it being more radical is because foreign countries were opposing it, which we'll get into in a moment. But because of that, there was also internal opposition and stuff. People are worried that somebody's going to try and stop the revolution, and that further incentivizes people to make the things even more radical. So that's kind of problematic. So that happens, and this kind of culminates in the Reign of Terror. So we've got, I believe this is 1791. So 1791 is basically when the Reign of Terror begins. We've got this one guy called Robespierre, and he's a vocab word, so you got to know that. Robespierre. I mean, you probably remember him, but Robespierre is the head of the Committee of Public Safety during this time, or I love the fact that it's literally COPS. It's acronym, but okay. So the Committee of Public Safety is just executing people left and right, people who it claims are threatening their revolutionary ideals, and that includes actually a lot of people who founded the French Revolution, ironically enough. And in the end, Robespierre is executed himself for creating this period of tyranny and for supposed because and his charges were creating that tyranny in time of fear and paranoia. But things become really violent during the French Revolution, and that's why it was considered quite problematic by many people at the time. And what doesn't help is that five countries decide to gang up the first coalition. You can just refer to it as the first coalition in your LEQ, but the five countries are, I believe, uh, Russia, Prussia, Austria, Spain, and Britain. Was it Spain? I think so. Uh, so these are the five countries that basically ganged up against France, and at the same time, France was having a civil war. And so you might think, how in the world is France not doomed? And the answer is simple: Napoleon. Napoleon is amazing in the eyes of the French people. he somehow he uses his genius to defeat all these countries and defeat them badly too. And so he beats up all these countries, and he comes back victorious. So everybody really loves Napoleon. Napoleon's super cool. And so Napoleon essentially by 1799 he's going to march into power. So 1799, you know, I don't think you actually need to remember this, but 1799 Napoleon gets to power. Napoleon. Okay. So Napoleon gets to power 1799, and so Napoleon essentially kind of soothes things down a little bit. So while Napoleon does so he continues to support these revolutionary ideas. Napoleon will make it so that these things are a little bit less radical. He's going to because he's going to have a military dictatorship, right? So this idea of like liberty and like government and stuff is going to decline, but at the same time, a lot of the ideas of freedom he's going to promote, and so people really like him because he's the only real revolutionary government that's actually done something good. Because Napoleon actually solves the economic crisis. If you remember earlier, I said the rising price of bread, right? That was a big reason. There was an economic problem in France, and Napoleon finally solves that. The people love him because he's actually doing what the revolution promised. He's giving them some rights, and he's giving them more, and he's giving them the economic stability. And Napoleon is going to invade basically all of Europe, and so Napoleon invading a ton of Europe and basically making the biggest empire in Europe in a long time, for it, although quite short lived. Because of that, his revolutionary ideas, he's gonna try and spread them, and he's going to, he's gonna spread his ideas of freedom that you. He conquers the place, and then he's like, "You guys are now free." I don't know how free you are if somebody's forcing freedom upon you, but really that's a question that still eludes us to this day. Is the is country our country is Western countries in trying to quote unquote force freedom upon people in more autocratic countries truly right? I don't know. Anyways, going back to the point, these ideas of freedom go spread throughout Europe because of Napoleon's invasion, and of course, sharp opposition to that freedom arises, but at the same time, Napoleon is going to have a lasting impact because with his army, so too will his. And not only will his not only will he conquer those places, but he'll spread those revolutionary ideas there. So those ideas of the Enlightenment, like freedom and all. And so I just looked back at this and I realized that I completely skipped how the French Revolution impacted women. I'm sorry about that. So that's probably important. When it comes to women, we can talk about Olympe de Gouges. And she was an important woman. Uh, so Olympe de Gouges, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. One second. All right, let me do my best based on what I saw. So it's pronounced Olympe de Gouges or something like that. Anyways, I digress. So, pretty much what her thing is she says that not only that all men are born free and equal, she says that all people, including women, are also free. And so I believe so. She's pretty important. I think she was a playwright. Yeah. So she is an important figure in the advocacy for women's rights in the French Revolution. But unfortunately, women don't really get that many rights. The thing is that a lot of the French revolutionaries, they they tended to be a little bit dismissive of women's rights. However, women are still important in the French Revolution because women lead a ton of the protests. You know, like the women are not just sitting back and like I don't know, like doing whatever in their homes. No, they're out in they were during the French Revolution. They're out in the public sphere protesting and all. So the women do have a role, and because of that, women begin to kind of raise the question of the fact that maybe women are not just irrelevant. You know. So the French Revolution sparks those kind of questions, but at the same time, it doesn't really grant women that much rights. And also like the French government, the National Assembly does things like it disbands like women's clubs and stuff because they're protesting how it's focused the revolution is focused on men a lot. So it's not going to immediately benefit women, but if down the road it's going to pave the road for more rights for women in the future. Okay. And so the next guiding question is what effect the French Revolution had on French politics and society. So the thing is, when it comes to politics, people are actually gonna now begin to discuss politics like openly, right? I'm gonna talk to my friend about politics and what's going on. It's not simply just a thing that's maybe just talked about in specific context. It's just an openly talked about thing by the general public too. And when it comes to society, the the okay, so back to it. So pretty much what's going on is that in France, right, a lot of the authority that was once part of different parts or things, right? So like the church and all, right? Those are going to go shift more towards the state and towards different societies, right? So like before the church is going to handle things like marriage, it'll handle births, deaths, etc. Now the state is handling all of that, and that continues to this day in most countries, right? I don't think there's any countries which use a religious authority to track those things anymore. And so that's a big thing, right? So these things are going to change society in France, right? And so and on to the next guiding question: how does idea spread? As I mentioned, Napoleon's going to conquer the places and all, and so that's going to be a big thing. And, so now I'm just going to go on to the Haitian Revolution, right? So basically, that was once known as the colony of Saint Domingue. Saint Domingue is going to be the most richest, richest as in it produces a ton of money, right? The when it comes to sugar. Okay. And so Haiti is I'll say Saint Domingue for now. Saint Domingue is a very important colony, and it's part of France, right? And then what happens in France is that they sign the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen, and they're like, hey, that sounds pretty cool, right? And so that inspires ideas in Haiti. And so let me just talk about the first guiding question though, because it's relates a lot to what created all this division in Haiti. So and that is what did the French Revolution mean to each social group in Haiti? And so the social groups we've got first the Grands Blancs. I'm guessing it's like seems like S's are pronounced silent in French a lot. I'm guessing it's like Grand Blanc or something. I don't know. And so these people basically they are the rich white people owning slaves, tons of slaves, right? Not just a few slaves, and so they're at the top of the social pyramid or the social hierarchy in Haiti, and so what they want out of this revolution is that they want more economic independence from France. They don't want to be subjected to as much regulation from France. And then next up, we've got the Petit Blanc. I don't know. Okay, so Petit Blanc, and we've got another class in the middle here, and that's the J de Color Libres. Okay, and so what what these two groups are is that the Petit Blanc are poor whites. That is, they do not own more. They don't more own more than 20 slaves. Oh my god, why is it so white? Can you even see it, my board? I hope you can. I hope this is fixed in the actual video. Anyways, so they want to be these people the Petit Blanc they resent the power that the Grand Blancs have, right? And so they want essentially equality with the Grand Blanc. And both of these groups dislike the Gens de Color Libres, okay? And these are the free black people. The free black people can own slaves and all, and they're in competition with the petit black, the poor whites, right? The free blacks are in competition with the poor whites in general, and these people can even own slaves themselves, but they're competing with each other in this social hierarchy. And both of these don't want the free blacks to have more rights. And then, of course, at the very bottom, we have unsurprisingly got the enslaved people. And so for the free blacks, they they want to have equality with the whites, right? In general. Um, Whereas when it comes to the enslaved people, they want to abolish slavery. And so each of these different groups has their own agenda, I suppose, in a way. But but this ends up fueling the revolution. So there's going to be a lot of chaos. And so, but eventually, you're gonna have this one guy called Toussaint. I remember someone. Overheard someone in class saying this, but it helped me remember his name a lot. But remember, it rhymes with croissant, croissant Toussaint. So I don't remember who said that in class, but overheard someone saying it. Anyways, so this like Toussaint guy is going to come to a lot of power as a, and he's going to kind of like lead this revolution for the enslaved black people, and eventually they're going to rise to the top of the hierarchy, and they're going to become the most prominent group in the revolution. And so, something to keep in mind is that there's kind of two stages of the revolution. The first stage is shortly after the French Revolution, right? So they see the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen, they're like, hey, honestly, we should have freedom too. And although it may start with these higher classes, it eventually goes to here where it becomes quite big. And so the National Assembly, as we mentioned earlier, it was really radical, and that's good and that's bad, and it's also good in some ways. Here, the National Assembly is actually going to grant them. It's going to abolish slavery for a bit, and these enslaved people are like, woohoo, right? Now that they've gotten their freedom, what is there to fight for? They're cool being a French colony. They just want to shift more towards small scale farming and stuff rather than being these massive sugar plantations and all. But the problem is that Napoleon is going to come in a couple of years, and he's gonna, as I mentioned earlier, he solves a lot of the financial problems, and he's going to do that through things such as like actually like making a uniform tax collection system and stuff. But one other way he's going to try to do that is by reinstituting slavery, and the slaves are not going to just like they had freedom. They're not going to go back to being slaves, right? I think Miss Wilger went over this quite a bit to the Haitian Revolution, so I think that you should know this a little bit better. But they don't want to be slaves again, obviously. So the French government tries to use force. Then they just declare war. They basically declare war, and they eventually get their independence from France. Uh, so that's like all good and dandy for them, but the problem is that it eventually there's going to this is going to mean the end of slavery for good in Haiti, or well, and but the problem is that they're not going to actually do so well after, because for various reasons there's lots of economic problems shifting from the plantation based system to small scale farming, and then it doesn't really help that shortly after France gave them an independence debt that they forced them to pay, and we also know about that. We talked about it quite a bit in class. I don't think I'm going to dwell more on the Haitian Revolution because I think I've just been blabbering on about it for a while, and we talked about it a lot. I think you should know about this one the best. All right, so now we're going to be on to the Latin American revolutions. I apologize if my voice is not quite coming out well. But in the Latin American revolutions, uh, let's just start with the guiding questions, actually. I think that's going to be a little bit better. So, first of all, we're going to start with why those revolutions occurred almost 50 years after the American Revolution, right? So, the big thing in Latin America is that there's big class differences, okay? So, at the top, you've got like the Creoles, right? And so these are the whiter people, right? And so the thing is that because you've got these more like elite Creoles and all, and then you've got all these like people of color and all, it there's going to be a lot of there's going to be a lot of division because of that class. Because if you remember, there's a lot more control from Europe over these colonies, unlike in with Britain and the Americas, where the Americas were mostly left alone until they decided to tax them a little more, and then they got their independence. What happened here is that what happened is that they are pretty tightly governed, and they're gonna have a and just like Europe, they're gonna have a strong class based system. and so that's going to be a little bit of a problem for them. So yeah, but what's going to happen is that in the early 1800s until between the 1820s, we're going to see a lot of revolutions, and it doesn't actually these revolutions don't start off with what we now know to be like the revolutions that actually succeeded, but it more so starts with class-based things because we know about one of the most important rebellions is the Hidalgo Morales rebellion, or Morales. I can't quite pronounce it. But this rebellion is going to basically be a peasant uprising that tries to get some like taxes and stuff reduced. But unfortunately, the Creoles are going to put down this rebellion. Unfortunately for them, and so that's not good. And they're going to get even more paranoid about what's going to happen if like lower classes elevate themselves because they see the example of the French Revolution, right? The lowest class, the third estate, goes and replaces the upper two estates, and then they all get executed and stuff, right? The Haitian Revolution was also fairly violent from towards the white people on the island, so they don't want that to happen to them. And then they're gonna try and make sure that the people at the lower part of the social hierarchy don't elevate themselves because that's not good for them. And so because of all this like division, right? Division between the classes, gender, etc. It's going to make it a little bit more difficult for them to start off having these like big revolutions, right? And so that's a big thing. And so I'm just gonna one thing I want to talk about also is just really quickly, Bolivar's letter from Jamaica, which was in the which was in the what is it called in the vocab words, right? And so this was a letter by Bolivar that tried to essentially tell people that we are going to be independent, and it's just telling the European countries like, hey, don't help Spain out. Like we're getting independent, whether you like it or not. I believe that's what it was essentially, but you can read through the article linked on the assignment because I might have misinterpreted it. Anyways, um, so Bolivar is going to be important because what Bolivar does is he's like a more wealthy like Creole. One of the Creoles, but Bolivar is going to be a big revolutionary guy. And so he's going to lead a lot of these revolutions and help them get independence. And a lot of the reason why this happened during this time frame is because, if you remember from earlier, right, Napoleon goes and invades all of Europe, right? And part of that is Spain and Portugal. Spain and Portugal, of course, are the ones who have like these big empires in the Americas. And so this is going to cause little bit of chaos in the Americas, right? Like what is it? In like because they're going to depose the Spanish king, right? And then they're going to get the I believe the Portuguese government, they flee the country, the royal government, the royals. So that's not good, right? There's a little bit of chaos in the area, and then they're not happy about that. So they need to do something, and that kind of also paves the way for these revolutions. And so that's basically what we need to know. Tupac Amaru is the next vocab word. And Tupac Amaru is going to lead a rebellion in the late 1700s, and it's going to essentially try and establish a new Inca state because he claims descent from the last Incan emperor because he calls himself Tupac Amaru the second. Tupac Amaru was actually the last Incan emperor who was executed by the Spanish, and so Tupac Amaru the second is proclaims himself the rightful emperor, and he leads a pretty good rebellion, but of course he's defeated. And so once again, this is once more reinforcing that fear that the upper class Creoles have of the lower class. But the problem is that even if you're going to be the upper class and you don't really like the lower class getting more power, you still need like a decent amount of widespread support in order to actually be able to succeed in your revolution, right? So if you're a revolutionary, how do we try and create this unity that allows Latin America to go together and be able to and have the quote unquote the people fight against the rulers, right? So the way you do that is that you gotta is that you they decide to have this Americana movement, and basically like we are all Americanas, right? Regardless of your class, regardless of your gender, we are all Americanas. Like even like if you're an indigenous person, if you're like mixed race, if you're white, in the end, they try to cultivate this sense of shared identity as Americanas. And to an extent, this actually still exists in Latin America, right? We often call like people in Latin America, we refer to Latin Americans as a collective whole often, right? And so this sense of shared identity is tries to bring people together. And although it's not easy, it's somewhat succeeds. It succeeds to an extent. All right, and so now the last vocab term we have here is San Martin. San Martin is going to be another revolutionary who's similar to Simon Bolivar. He's going to go and try. He's going to be a little bit more higher class, and he'll be a military leader trying to help get independence. Okay, so that's pretty important. And then finally, our last guiding question is: how did people of color and women play a part in the independence movements in Latin America? Right. So let's just talk about women a little. So women, they're gonna do a major part because they're gonna play some role because what they'll do is that they're going to how they're gonna they'll host like the meetings that the revolutionaries are having. The women are also going to they're going to give like cook and stuff, and so they're gonna do various things like this that are pretty important. But the thing is that in the aftermath of these revolutions, the women are often going to they're not really going to get that many rights in the end, unfortunately, because for these women, like while they will be playing a part an important part in the rebellion, they're going to they're in the end they're not they're not yeah once again they're just not going to get rights. They'll get a little bit more recognition. People will recognize like some who accomplished a lot, and some women were even like executed by the Spanish and stuff. But so they'll be recognized, as I said, and they'll get a little bit more rights in terms of like education and stuff, but it's not that much, unfortunately. Then when it comes to people of color, people, as I mentioned earlier, with that Americana movement, right? They needed a lot of people to be together because they need many people to like fill their armies and all, right? So people of color are going to play that role, and essentially, that's pretty much all there is to it. Uh, I hope this video was helpful. I know it's a little bit lower quality, actually a lot more lower quality, but hopefully it was decently useful.